Perfect. All right. All right. Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alice Lee, and I'm from the University of California, Riverside. A big thank you to Sharon Tedegaw for inviting me here and the opportunity to share my work at the Center for Black Studies Research. I'm really excited to share this work, which was just published in the journal Literacy Research, Theory, Method, and Practice. And I'm grateful to the editors of that journal who awarded that publication with the More Just World Award. My talk today responds to calls from the field of literacy to employ a wide-angle view and to include multiple voices in our understandings of literacy. Sometimes, however, when we talk about making sure to include multiple voices, ironically, Black voices can be obscured. Within a teacher education context that has historically been and continues to be overwhelmingly white, widening our view of literacy education requires us to interrogate where our gaze rests upon. White monolingual norms continue to dominate classrooms, and this should not be a surprise to us, since the spaces that prepare such classrooms adhere to the same norms. As literacy scholars, there is an onus on us to not only change what is taught in our methods courses, but more importantly, the very means by which our content is taught. We need to radically shift how we come to know, understand, and do literacy if we are to hope for the same in classrooms. In this talk, I share examples of how I've begun this journey and widen my view of literacy by foregrounding Black language as a mentor text. Oftentimes, it can be interpreted that to include multiple voices means that we sprinkle in other voices, all the while still maintaining white monolingual norms at the very core. We see this in teacher ed with the one required diversity course, or when samples of diversity get sprinkled in through multicultural texts, diverse readings, and minoritized communities get highlighted here and there. And don't get me wrong, these elements are absolutely necessary to any critical pedagogy, but oftentimes these things get sprinkled in while the core of how we teach reading, writing, phonemic awareness continue to be entrenched in white monolingual norms. Such an approach silos issues of literacy and equity. And when we mutually exclude them in literacy methods, we perpetuate white-centric instruction. So today I want to offer an approach to literacy education that centers equity in the process of teaching literacy methods. By intertwining the two, this approach significantly shifts whose epistemologies are centered and offers a different pathway for future teachers to envision literacy instruction. I present a pedagogical model that explicitly centers Black linguistic norms. In doing so, this work not only incites awareness for how white linguistic norms are thoroughly normalized, but also models for pre-service teachers how literacy curricula must move beyond tokens of diversity. As a non-Black person and non-Black researcher, a non-Black language speaker, I want to foreground how I approach this work, especially since we've seen how research can lead to either colonial or emancipatory ends. I'm a Chinese American woman. I work in solidarity with Black language scholars and communities who have long led the fight for justice and civil rights in our country. I believe that our freedoms are tethered together and that until all of us are liberated, none of us are liberated. Within my own lived history, my parents immigrated here in 1971 after the 1965 Immigration Act, which is a direct result of the Black Civil Rights Movement. As a woman of color, I'm aware of all the splaining that happens in all sorts of directions. And I'm clear that I'm a guest who's been invited into a very sacred space, and that any education I have about Black language will never supersede what an African-American Black language speaker knows. I know the term Asian Black solidarity has been popularized in the last couple of years, but I see my work over the last decade, first as a teacher and now as researcher, as one that embodies Asian Black solidarity and one that builds a future of solidarity for all of our children. My pedagogical approach is undergirded by linguistic and ratiolinguistic conceptions of Black language. Anti-Blackness begins in pre-K classrooms when Black language fails to be linguistically recognized and continues all the way through into teacher preparation when the language is ignored in programming. We have over half a century, 50 years of linguistic research showing how Black language is legitimate, and over 20 years of calls for teachers to stop their anti-Blackness and change how they teach Black children. So what are we waiting for, and how much longer must we wait? Flores and Rosa's notion of racial-linguistic ideologies inform us that there is an onus on whiteness within institutions to act. Thus, as teacher educators, there is an onus on us to act on the unfulfilled calls for change. The field of racial-linguistics teaches us that the discrimination of Black language and Black students are one and the same, and also explain why so little has changed despite 50 years of research. The examples I provide come from an elementary literacy methods course I taught for several years in a predominantly white institution. In this course, the selected text before I arrived was Kusser and Silva's Teaching the Dimensions of Literacy. What I thought the text did well was approach literacy through a multidimensional lens. For the purposes of this presentation, I'm focusing on the linguistic, sociocultural, and cognitive dimensions, and I discuss the distinctions when I'm teaching them. However, the book is clear, and I'm also clear, that these dimensions are not clearly distinct, but are intricately intertwined in practice. The book also discusses a fourth dimension, the developmental dimension, and this explains how our literacies continue to develop over time and in new contexts. So these dimensions should not be understood as something to be mastered. In explaining the linguistic dimension, the authors describe it as cracking the code of written text. This requires teachers to understand the various systems that make a language a language. So I highlight three from the text that are often the building blocks for how teachers understand literacy. Syntax, or the rules of grammar within a sentence, often constitutes what teachers are looking at within student writing. So like whether or not that should be the case is a whole nother presentation. But my point is that syntactic structures are often a focal point in writing instruction. Then we have morphemes, or the meaning of words when its smallest parts are put together. Those are important in learning vocabulary and reading instruction. And then orthography comes, with spelling patterns among words and is an integral component within writing instruction. So people often ask me, well, how do we know this is a real language? What makes this a real language? So after students read the book, I discuss some of these same systems of language. And this is a snapshot of an actual slide I use in my lectures. I review this idea of what makes language a language, namely that it's systematic and there are rules to each of the systems of language. This is a foundational point that I use in transitioning to Black language because most people think of the language as slang or not a real language. So all the language systems students learned about when we utilize Black language as a case for applying these linguistic concepts, this is the slide that I sort of show them. And of course, these are just a couple of examples that many are familiar with, but it allows students to begin mapping Black language as linguistically legitimate. And this again is something that has been addressed in research for over half a century. In the process of showing how various language systems appear in Black language, pre-service teachers not only learn about these systems, but they also learn that Black language is indeed a real language. So if we understand it as real, then we must attune to the very real ways it's altogether ignored in our classrooms. There have been growing efforts to double down on phonics instruction for young children. But we have to remember that all languages actually have a phonetic component. So when phonics instruction ignores the letter-sound relationship for Black language and all other languages, we can see how phonics instruction indeed belongs to white mainstream English. And then we haven't even begun to scratch, like as a field, we haven't even begun to scratch the surface on incorporating Black language in phonics instruction, let alone all the aspects of literacy instruction. At this point, many have learned that Black language is linguistically legitimate for the first time and wonder why they had never learned this before, especially given all the research that's been done about it. And this is where I introduce the sociocultural dimension of literacy to talk about how language doesn't exist in a vacuum, but within a larger sociopolitical hierarchy. Language and the way we use it in our social and cultural contexts across modalities comprise the way literacy becomes events, practices, and performances of who we are and what we represent within our society. And then this is where I bring in ideas of sociolinguistics as well as Baker Bell's work on anti-Black linguistic racism. Our literacies, therefore, are entangled within power and oppression. And understanding this dimension also means our literacies are born out of historical patterns that are imbued with cultural meanings. The book actually defines literacy events as an interaction with print text. But I push on this Western-rooted notion of print literacy, which emphasizes the written word over oral communication. So I return back to Black language as a mentor text, so to speak. In addition to helping students understand how anti-Blackness and the treatment of Black language are one and the same, I also push against Western biased notions of literacy with the orality of Black language. So here's another example from my lecture slides that shows the verbal strategies and rhetorical devices used in Black language. And this comes from Geneva Smitherman's work. Narrative sequencing is especially important when it comes to oral and written literacy practices like show and tell, when stories can be more episodic in nature rather than topic centered. And I'm also clear with students that while Black language is rooted in Afrocentric languages and histories, not all Black people speak Black language, nor are all Black language speakers Black. And then after it's been established that Black language is linguistically legitimate and represents Black liberation within white hegemonic structures, I move into a core component of so many literacy curricula, reading instruction. The cognitive dimension of literacy focuses on how readers make meaning with text, and teachers often rely on reading assessments that include oral fluency to measure students' cognition. Such assessments become the basis for students' literary identities. While some assessments like Goodman's work on retrospective miscue analysis offers room for language diversity in understanding students' cognition, other assessments can be detrimental for Black language speakers when they ignore the existence of the language. So this is another lecture slide, and it shows an example of a 1-minute reading fluency test I actually proctored when I was an elementary school teacher. We were required to click on any word that was said that didn't align with the written text. So the bracket right here is how far she read in that 1-minute period. The student was a Black language speaker, and she read this text. And as she did, she dropped the S on the word Jamie's, which is syntactically correct in Black language because you do not need the apostrophe S to signify possession. So when you look at how many quote unquote errors she had, 2 out of 5 or 40%, it's because Black language syntax is not recognized within reading fluency tests. And we know that these low scores early on become a vicious cycle when students then get put in remedial reading groups and are often not instructed for deep comprehension. I problematize, therefore, these white-centric oral fluency tests that often play a major role in defining students' cognition and ultimately their literary identities. So I further my point by sort of flipping the script on my pre-service teachers by making them take a 1-minute fluency test in Black language. I have them pair up, and each person has to read as many words as they can, while the other person is marking down words pronounced or said incorrectly based on Black language phonetics and syntax. This text is a Vershawn Ashanti's Young research article written in Black language. Most students find this exercise extremely difficult, not only the oral fluency aspect, but also the speed and comprehension of reading in a language they're unfamiliar with. Most students share that they lack confidence reading aloud in Black language, and thus their oral reading is slower, and they had a need to reread phrases in order to comprehend. I then asked them to imagine if Black language was the main mode of communication in every textbook, every book in classroom libraries, all instruction, and every interaction with teachers and principals. How would they feel about reading, about school, and about learning at large? At this juncture, many pre-service teachers reach an epiphany about the harm done to Black language speakers. And I use this learning engagement as a starting point for imagining what a non-white centric literacy curricula might look like. As literacy educators, we have the power to either reify or rectify the harm done to Black language speakers in schools. The pedagogical model for literacy methods education offered here shifts our starting point from sprinkling linguistic diversity into coursework to centering Black language in the process of understanding what literacy is. Such a shift is urgent from pre-K classrooms all the way to our teacher preparation programs, which pay very little attention to Black language, despite a resurgence of purported care and commitment towards Black lives. It is important then that we fight to cohere our precepts and our practices in our work towards equity. All right, so that concludes what I want to share today, but I'm open to discussion and thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that very much, Dr. Lee. I think you mentioned some very important things, and again, Living Lives appreciated even more so, as well as the Center for Black Studies Research. We actually have a question from someone in Zoom. It is, with respect, the ways in which you approach the discussion of language's reality, what are the resources you point to for illustration? As a linguist and lexicographer, I often share how Black language is present in the dictionary and other so-called official sources, but I struggle with the ethics of appealing to white stream, thanks for this term, products for legitimacy. So it's there also on your virtual site. Yes. And if you could please answer the question and respond to this person via Zoom.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Wright, for this question. I'm just looking at it to just get a better, sometimes when you hear things, let me just read this really quick. Yeah, and I do want to clarify that the term white stream is not my term. It is a term that I think I cited it in my, I'm sharing this work from my my recent publication. So I believe that I cited where that came from. I can't remember the name off the top of my head, but yeah, I think that other resources. I think especially at the secondary level, there's certainly growing work. I mentioned April Baker Bell's work, and I know other, Lamar Johnson, of course, Elaine Richardson, the original Dr. Geneva Smitherman, Carmen Kennard, all different aspects of Black language at the secondary and even college level. I think that, yeah, at the early childhood and elementary, we are certainly lacking resources that effectively get at Black language in critical ways. I think there have been approaches that the names I've mentioned, and other critical language scholars have really published work around how just even code switching, this idea of forcing students to speak one way in classrooms to learn, and another way outside of that is really a form of linguistic segregation. Vershawn Ashanti Young, that, of course, that's another resource, but also he writes about that as well. So I think that the topic, though, of really getting into thinking about Black language as it pertains to learning language when young children are learning language and learning to read, that's a frontier that we need to address. And I think that we need more people that are doing this work, but I'm working on some of those resources myself. I don't know if that answers your question. Dr. Wright, please feel free to follow up.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lee. Dr. Wright, if you like, if you want to actually continue and ask additional follow-up questions, I can give you permission to speak. Could you please just let me know if that's what you would like?
I have a question.
Yes,
Go ahead.
yes.
Yeah. So thanks for the presentation. It's very enlightening. So my question is that, so how do we galvanize support to making sure that we're able to recognize sufficiently, Black languages,
Yeah.
and especially when it comes to educational reform? What would you suggest? How do we approach it?
You know, people have asked me, what do we need to do in order for like Black language to be fully incorporated and accepted and centered and honored and everything in the classroom? And, I alluded to ratiolinguistics and this idea of race and language being like intertwined. And so really our hatred of Black language is really a hatred of Black people. And so I think, coming from a critical race perspective, I think that, like when we can stop hating Black people, I think there might be opportunities to like begin like really loving Black language and honoring it in that's more of a philosophical answer and not, but I think that there are real things that we can do right now, which is I think there is an aspect of educating about Black language that needs to happen across K-12 schooling. But at the same time, we need my other line of research, I theorize, which I've called teacher embodiment as lived pedagogy. And I talk about the ways that teachers of color, especially Black teachers, offer a unique linguistic and racial, this racial, out of their racial and linguistic lived experiences, they do the culturally responsive work that people like Lori Latson-Billings and other researchers have documented. And so my point, I bring it into in order for Black linguistic justice to happen in classrooms, we also need a teacher workforce that understands Black language, is linguistically competent in Black language, and can leverage it as a tool, not only in their own instruction, but also in building rapport with students and intermixing it within their own pedagogy. So that's a big, I think that's it, because I think that we have seen decades of efforts and waves of pedagogical models that are needed and that are very, that are so important and critical to the work. But there's a disconnect in how those pedagogies are actually used and enacted in classroom spaces. I should say misused and unacknowledged, right? So I don't necessarily know if I think we do.
Okay, sorry, everyone, we're having a couple of things here, and we did have some additional questions from Dr. Wright, but for some reason we were having some technical difficulties. So we're waiting on Dr. Lee to actually come back on. For some reason, she was removed. But in the meantime, Dr. Wright, we have your questions in the Q&A, and we can follow up with the questions in the Q&A once she's able to actually get back on. So I'm not quite sure what's going on here. So give us 1 second, please. One second.
I think you can vote.
No, shh, shh, shh. Okay, could you go ahead now, please, Dr. Lee?
Here we go. All right.
Question from Dr. Wright.
Okay. I don't see any, I think because I just joined on again. I don't see any
Okay. So one of the questions says, let me just put it on speaker. It says, in the face of 50 years of linguistic research, demonstrating definitively that Black linguistic varieties, but which have been unsuccessfully applied or produced, at least in the brain, in the same ways of other languages, how do you suggest we move forward? What types of tools do you as an educator need that perhaps linguistics as a discipline could provide to make the application of linguistics justice in your institutions a reality? I'm going to try to put that inside the chat because it's quite a bit, because I want you to be able to see it. Okay, let me see if I can get that in the chat.
Yeah.
All right, hold on a second. Okay, here we go. There you go. Okay.
Let's see. Oh, okay, I see it's in the chat now. Okay. Yeah, thank you for that question. I think that can you all hear me okay? Okay, I'm not on mute. I think that there's a lot to be desired in the ways that we are approaching literacy instruction today. I think with the resurgence of a focus on phonics in particular, I think what's lost in that resurgence is a focus on meaning making. And as a field of the field of literacy in the last like 50 years, when we move towards more of this focus on cognition and meaning making, I think while it was pretty race evasive, there was still opportunity to be able to like get at thinking about, I think we were headed in that direction, thinking about Black language speakers, and there was some avenue to incorporate that in the resurgence of like phonics, and specifically white mainstream English phonics. It's sort of, we go back and cut out really, all the different linguistic backgrounds of our linguistically diverse students. So I think that part is really problematic. And yeah, I think, so I think one of the questions I ask in this article is essentially, when we talk about phonics, like, who's phonics, right? Like, right, because every language has phonics. So when we say, well, phonics instruction and they need to get this and that, whose phonics are we looking at? And I think that's an entry point. I think sadly, this like resurgence of phonics instruction is, especially I'm seeing this in California, being taken up among communities of color and Black communities, and seeing it as like reading rights. And I absolutely, obviously am in support of reading rights and literacy rights. But I think that double down on phonics cuts out the literacy education history over the last 50 years. So that, I think we need to do some like grassroots work among communities of color, among Black communities in particular, as there's momentum to fight for our literacy rights, I think that's a component of it. And that can, potentially work in conjunction with, reform efforts. I think, it's not my necessarily area of expertise, but, just curricular adoption, right? The standardization of curriculum and things like that. That can be, there's that aspect that, and so many people have written about this, about, mandated curriculum and standardization and all of that, and that being a critical component in like the bottleneck for which we're able to like do what we need to do for students. So I think, and I want to be clear too, that, when I talk about the resurgence of doubling down on phonics instruction, I am not negating phonics instruction. In fact, the whole language approaches, cognition, none of that puts down or puts away phonics instruction. In fact, phonics instruction is a component of whole language. So I think there needs to be that aspect, but again, who's phonics and how does that get leveraged for learning, especially if we understand that, literacy, our language is the foundational vehicle for learning. So, I'm working through, I'm working through those questions myself, but those are just some of my thoughts. I saw a Q&A too. Okay, I put in, oh, you put it in that one. Okay, good. Okay. Oh, great. Thank you. Let's see. So the next question says, I've observed vital ways Black language does not translate in the legal system where language is tantamount. Yeah. The loss of nuance, layers of irony, context, complexity of relationship is lost. This is particularly dangerous in charting histories and testimony. What thought do you have about translation towards justice? Oh, such a good question. Stephanie Batiste, I think you asked that question. I'm happy to connect with you afterwards. If you have expertise in the legal system, I would be, I would love to have a further conversation about it. My area of expertise is not in the legal system, so I can't necessarily. I don't know that I don't know that I can speak to like the translation into the legal system and how that has been working. But I agree that there are many aspects of Black language, the layers that are lost. I think even when we think about, April Baker Bell writes a lot about this in her linguistic justice book, about the ways, these multinational corporations, white celebrities, right? Like all of these people take on Black language, right? We look at TikTok, right? Like all of these different social media take on Black language and use it to, in fact, make millions, billions of dollars to in their to get street cred and to look good and right and to seem cool, right? And yet we're teaching Black language speakers, children, that your language will not lead to any success in your future job. And yet these huge corporations, in fact, employ Black language for the very success and the financial success that we hope for Black language speakers to achieve. So I think that, other points that, April Baker Bell, Carmen Kennard, Geneva Smitherman, have talked about are the ways that Black language, when we talk about nuance, oftentimes it gets, we get stuck in just the linguistic dimension, and we don't even move into like the sociocultural aspects. Of course, there are the power issues, but even like the rhetorical devices, the call and response, the wordplay, right? There's so many layers of Black language. As a non-Black language speaker, I can't say that I understand all of them, but I can begin identifying the things that I don't understand and that I don't know, and appreciate it that much more about, appreciate that much more about the bilingualism of Black language speakers. So, That was not a very satisfying answer, I believe, probably, Stephanie, to your question. But I'm happy to further connect and hear more about the ways that you're more aware of what's happening in the legal system and those things. Oh, I see it. Let's see. Okay, another open question. Okay. Wonder if the disconnect emphasizes the degree to which we need to. Yeah. And I'm curious to hear more about so Stephanie said, thank you so much. I wonder if the disconnect emphasizes the degree to which we need to rethink translation in all environments. Yeah, I mean, I think, it speaks to English. I know that linguists are debating right now, should English continue to be the language of the global language of power, considering its colonial histories? How do we, is this a linguistic tool that is redeemable in our current global state, right? Heaven forbid we learn multiple languages like those in Asia and Africa and other continents, right? Like that, in which people are multilingual and can have a much larger linguistic repertoire than we do here. So yeah.
Thank you again. Are there any other questions for Dr. Lee? How about physically? Are there any other additional questions for Dr. Lee?
I'm just thinking generally. I mean, it might not be related to what you just discussed, but I'm just looking at the kind of opposition that we'll see if we want to say formalize or institutionalize Black languages into our curriculum space.
Yeah.
And I don't know whether we should continue to advocate for spaces where we encourage Black people to go to Black institutions and then get access to these languages, or go to a mixed place where you would have people who are more inclined to the phonetics and the phonics of it rather than, I mean, yes. So
Yeah.
I'm just looking at how you will be able to mix all that up.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think that's yes. So if I'm representing your question accurately, and please feel free to chime in again too, but you're sort of asking where do we begin with this, right? Like, what does this actually mean in our curriculum? So I do professional development in K-12 schools. And when I do that, I sort of map out how we can begin thinking about bringing in and inviting, honoring, respecting Black language in our literacy curriculum. And then, again, I focus in specifically early childhood and elementary. I think that part of it is just also doing an audit of all the harmful stuff. Let's first do an audit of getting rid of, and if it's redeemable, to revise and modify the things. So I just came out with an article that talked about, even in our pre-K classrooms, the ways that we do early childhood assessments. When we look at, oftentimes there are these rubrics and they're like, okay, are they using, is there alternation between the speaker and listener? Is there agreement between verbs based on whose syntax, right? So if a 3-year-old is producing Black language and has correct syntax with the correct verb and subject, then yes, they have met that standard. But when you have teachers who cannot recognize that, or who are not fluent in Black language, they will be like X, they don't, right? So there are a lot of, and I write, I talk about how it's part of a longer, even those kind of assessments, abstracting language, thinking about it in these like very like boxed in entity ways is actually a continuation of colonial traditions. So I don't know how redeemable that kind of like assessment is, but when we think about those kind of assessments, those do harm. Those do a lot of harm to Black language speakers and to Black children. And rather than thinking about how can we get our Black students to meet these standards, we have to interrogate the whole like assessment in and of itself. And in the article, I offer like examples of how like the Black teacher I was working with, she like would assess the preschool students in a way that was more consistent with, what I'm, probably, a more decolonial approach. So like, rather than thinking about language and assessing them in these like boxed in ways, she would actually take samples. She had a clipboard and she would write down phrases and samples of students and document their language, their language evolution from like the first day of school all the way till the beginning of 3 years old to the end of 3 years old, right? And on to 4 years old, right? So that you can document and you can see, are they improving in the number of utterances, in the lengths of the phrases that they're using, right? In their vocabulary, right? So I think there's like the nitty gritty, like those kinds of ways. I think when we move into like the elementary classroom, when we think about like assessments, like writing rubrics, oftentimes I cannot tell you how many times I've heard and witnessed like teachers say like, okay, like they'll see Black language in there and they'll be like, I don't even know what to do with this. They suck at writing and return and slash write all the red ink all over, write the writing. Well, here's the deal. If we focus on writing as many like writing scholars like Anne Haas-Dyson has written about this, and many other writing scholars talk about thinking about writing as cultivating their voice, right? And when we think about the authors that we celebrate, it's about their voice in their writing. So we can teach like conventions, like, right, you need a capital at the beginning of sentences, you need conventions, periods, question marks, quotation, right? We need all of those things. We can teach those things while also incorporating and bringing in Black language. I think those things often get conflated in writing rubrics, and you end up with a paper of like F, and then you therein discourage students' voices, right? So I think that, and then I get into a lot of things around even like guided groups, guided reading groups, guided writing groups, not like putting students, don't put all your Black language speakers in the lowest level group and teach them the alphabet in second grade. They know the alphabet, right? Like we can do more work than that. And I think that, I also draw on like Ophelia Garcia's work in thinking about like a translanguaging approach, right? And that thinks about the use of language in much more fluid and dynamic ways, while also still being able to assess their, learning, and also like learning content and language standards, right? So I think that there are ways to navigate that. We don't have that all tied into a book just yet, but I think that's some of the work, and the other early childhood Black language scholar I wanted to mention was Brittany Fryson. She's doing really remarkable work in thinking about how even in dual language Spanish programs, where oftentimes Spanish and Black language speakers are put in the same classroom, even there they face anti-Blackness against their Black language, right? So there's a lot of work to be done, but those are the ways that I've been sort of piecing together some of the ways that we can think about what are the like practical tools that we can do in schools. And I do think eventually it needs to become part of a, I hate to use the word curricula because everything becomes standardized and then misappropriated, but something, yes.
Generally run away from that too.
Yeah.
And so I think you spoke about the dualization of learning. So
Yeah.
I see here, for instance, you have the option to choose from Spanish and English, having a combination. I mean, we can move forward to having, especially in predominantly Black communities, having that option where you can
Yes.
choose from, I mean,
Yeah.
English, Black.
Yes. Yes.
Some sort of, I mean,
Yes.
then we know that we are putting the axe to the ground.
Yes. Yeah, no, I think that's, especially as, Geneva Smitherman pushed for that, even in the, you know, in the last century, right? She's pushed up for Black language, thinking about Black language speakers as bilingual, right? And what does that then mean in our, I think bilingual Black language classrooms would be amazing, right? I think we need that. And yeah.
I mean, if you take here where the population of Latinos is 48%,
Yeah.
and then we have an option, for instance, in elementary school where you can choose whether or not your child goes to a fully English class or dual language. We should be looking at
Yeah.
places that have predominantly Black people.
Yeah.
Maybe you would have to do a survey and even understand, for instance, what the number of people who speak Black language are interested in that. And then move forward to now having a discussion. Okay, should we have those schools having options where parents can opt? Okay, I want my child to be immersed in the Black language. At the same time, have some English attached to it. I mean, see where it goes.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. If there are no other questions, we want to leave it open right now. But if there are no other questions, then we'll wait a few minutes, see if Dr. Lee has provoked everyone to the extent where she covered it extremely well, and then there are no questions about her work. And there is one that just popped up in Q&A. So could you please go ahead and respond to
Yes.
that one? Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. All right. Stephanie's question says, okay, I have a question about the underlying civic theory of the field, simply because I don't know. I teach literature, so how do we understand a common language of citizenship? Yeah, so many good questions. So many good questions. I think, again, this is not necessarily, I'm reading more about this, I think it's, I have the work that I have been looking at is the book, I believe it's called Markets of English by Park and Wee. And they write about the colonial legacies of English and thinking about, just what I shared about before. There's debate if English should continue to be the global language of communication, especially given its colonial history. So, that, and I believe they are situated more in the field of linguistics. So that's an area that I'm continuing to learn. But I don't know. Yeah, I think when we think about a common language of citizenship, I think that's a really interesting question, because it then begs the question, like, who is the citizenry, right? And who is represented and who is not, who has power in our citizenry, and whose voices, literal voices and languages, continue to be ignored, marginalized, unacknowledged. So I think that, I think that we need to move. I think part of being more of a global citizenry is that we expand the ways that we communicate with each other as well. I think of course, social media has played an important role in our larger network of global communication, but I think even the languages that we're using, right? I know so many of us, especially those of us who have come to this country and we have, like my parents, I shared about how my parents immigrated, and immigrated here from Taiwan, and they, I even though like Mandarin was spoken in my home, because of the ways that white monolingualism played out in my own upbringing in schools and in the town that I grew up in, I felt the need to, and as many do, feel the need to divorce themselves from, from their home languages and stuff. So I think bringing in, right, like, and like you talk about, teaching literature. I mean, even when we think about the traditional canon, so much of that is imbued in like a history of enculturating our students within colonial legacies. So how, thinking about like who we're reading, the broader perspectives that we're bringing into our classrooms. I think all of that plays a role in this common language of citizenship. And then as well as like how we, like, if you're going, even when we think about the classroom, if you're going to be a citizen of this classroom, like, can you use the languages from your home to learn? Right? Like that's essentially that's, I think, at the heart of what I'm trying to get at is that, like, how can we only force students to learn in white mainstream English? That in and of itself is like mind-boggling, but yes, that is essentially what we have been doing and what we continue to do. So if we want to think about a larger language of citizenship, bringing in, like allowing students to use their languages in formal written assignments. And the way that I frame it also, I've talked about this in some of my previous articles that I've written, that, like when I teach it, like when I was a fifth grade teacher, we can't get away from like the standardized tests. And, as we speak, the California state testing is happening right now, and they are assessed in white mainstream English. So like one of the ways that, that I would frame it to my elementary school students is, here's the deal, is that the people who are reading this, they're not as linguistically gifted as you. They only speak one language, right? So you are linguistically gifted, you're bilingual, you can, you can communicate in a variety of ways. So but the people who are reading this, they don't have as much language as you. And so you kind of have to write it for them so that they understand it, And so, so then it's more about audience, right? And then they realize, okay, yeah, I'm going to write it so that they understand my brilliance, right? And then, and then you should have throughout the year other graded formal written assignments that are celebrated, put on the classroom walls, published, that are written incorporating Black language, Spanish, like all Mandarin, right? All the languages that are represented in our citizenry. So yeah, that's a little bit of, those are some of my thoughts. Stephanie, are we ready to, I know that our time is coming to a close. Should we, I don't see any other open questions. So should I just oh, Stephanie said really beautiful. Thank you. So thank you so much, Stephanie, for your questions. And please feel free to reach out to me. I would love to further connect and dialogue. I think you bring up a lot of really important points, and we have to, we have to come together in thinking about solution making. So I just want to thank, on behalf of the Center for Black Studies Research at UC Santa Barbara, thank you for this wonderful time and space to share and, engage in really, I think, important dialogue. So, all right, thanks everyone. Have a great day.